You're looking at a daguerreotype from March 1821, taken in the parlor of Whitmore House, Essex County. The image shows a boy of perhaps 12 years, seated rigidly in a wooden chair. His hands rest precisely on his knees, his dark eyes fixed on something beyond the camera's range. What you cannot see in this photograph is what the boy was saying at the moment of exposure. According to 3 witnesses present that morning, he was speaking fluent hieratic script. The ancient Egyptian language had been dead for over 1,000 years. The boy had never left the village of Millbrook, never attended school, never seen a book. Dr. Cornelius Ashworth, the local physician who commissioned this daguerreotype, wrote in his journal that day, "The child's pronunciation matches no known dialect of our time." Yet linguistic experts who later examined Ashworth's phonetic transcriptions confirmed an impossible truth. The boy was reciting passages from the Edwin Smith Papyrus with perfect accuracy, a document that would not be discovered by archaeologists for another 67 years. The parlor where this photograph was taken has remained sealed since 1823. The reasons why will become clear as we examine what Dr. Ashworth found in that room, and what found him in return. What you're about to hear challenged every assumption about memory, time, and the boundaries of human consciousness. The case file was marked resolved by the Essex County Medical Board in October 1821. It was reopened without explanation in 1889, then sealed again the same day. The boy's name was recorded as Thomas Hartwell, but according to parish records, no child by that name was born in Millbrook between 1808 and 1815. The photograph you're looking at may be the only proof he ever existed. Yet 3 separate investigations concluded that Thomas Hartwell died in 1819, 2 years before Dr. Ashworth met him, 2 years before this image was captured. The daguerreotype shows no signs of double exposure or manipulation. The shadows fall correctly, the light appears natural, the focus is sharp throughout. But if you examine the reflection in the window behind the boy's left shoulder, you'll notice something. The glass shows not one figure seated in the chair, but 2. And the second figure appears to be wearing the ceremonial headdress of an Egyptian scribe, a detail that went unnoticed for nearly 2 centuries, until a digital restoration in 2003 revealed what the human eye had missed. The year 1821 marked the height of Britain's fascination with Egyptian antiquities. Napoleon's expedition had returned with countless artifacts, and every drawing room displayed miniature pyramids and scarab jewelry. Yet true understanding of hieroglyphic writing remained beyond the reach of even the most learned scholars. The Rosetta Stone had been discovered, but Jean-François Champollion would not publish his decipherment until the following year. In rural Essex, such exotic knowledge seemed as distant as the moon itself. Millbrook was a farming village of perhaps 300 souls, connected to London only by a weekly mail coach. The residents lived by the rhythm of seasons and the tolling of St. Michael's bells. Gas lighting had not yet reached the countryside. Telegraph wires were still decades away. Into this world of thatched cottages and candlelight came a mystery that defied every natural law. The first documented account appears in the ledger of Dr. Cornelius Ashworth, village physician and amateur naturalist. His entry from March 15th reads, "Summoned to examine a child found wandering the Blackwood Heath at dawn." The boy had been discovered by Shepherd William Graves, who reported the child speaking in tongues unknown. Ashworth's initial examination noted nothing unusual. Height 4 feet, weight perhaps 5 stone, no visible injuries or signs of distress. But when the boy opened his mouth to speak, the physician's scientific worldview began to crumble. "The sounds he produces," Ashworth wrote, "correspond to no European language I have encountered in 30 years of practice." The doctor had studied Latin, Greek, and Hebrew at Cambridge. He recognized French and German when spoken by travelers passing through the village. But this was something else entirely. Consonants formed deep in the throat, vowels that seemed to echo from hollow places. Ashworth transcribed what he heard using a phonetic system of his own devising. Those transcriptions, preserved in the archives of the Essex County Historical Society, would later prove unnaturally accurate. The boy appeared to understand English perfectly, nodding when questioned, following simple instructions. But every word from his lips emerged in that strange, ancient tone. Dr. Ashworth's training demanded a rational explanation. Perhaps the child was foreign-born, possibly Italian or Spanish, confused by trauma or illness. Yet something in the boy's manner, the careful way he held his hands, the precise angle of his posture, suggested a different possibility. It was as though he had been trained in the deportment of a different age. The physician's journal entry concluded with a note that would prove prophetic. "I fear this case may require expertise beyond my modest capabilities." Within hours, that fear would transform into something approaching terror. For the boy was about to demonstrate that his linguistic abilities were merely the beginning of a far deeper mystery. Dr. Ashworth arranged temporary lodging for the boy at Whitmore House, the village's modest inn. The proprietress, Mrs. Eleanor Whitmore, agreed to provide room and board while inquiries were made about the child's origins. The morning of March 16th dawned gray and still, with fog hanging low over the marshlands beyond the village. At precisely 8 o'clock, Mrs. Whitmore sent word that Dr. Ashworth's immediate presence was required. She would say only that the boy had done something impossible with the wallpaper. The physician arrived to find the child seated calmly in the inn's front parlor, apparently absorbed in studying a botanical illustration on the wall. But the wallpaper itself told a different story. The pattern, simple roses and vines printed in London, had somehow been altered overnight. Between the familiar English flowers, new symbols had appeared, hieroglyphic characters impressed into the paper as if by an invisible hand. Mrs. Whitmore swore the walls had been unmarked when she retired the previous evening. She had checked the room herself, as was her custom with unknown guests. The symbols were not drawn or painted. They appear to be part of the paper's original design. Yet the wallpaper had been installed only 2 months earlier, purchased from a reputable London firm that dealt exclusively in European patterns. Dr. Ashworth examined each character with his magnifying lens, sketching them carefully in his notebook. The precision was remarkable, each hieroglyph formed with the skill of a master scribe. But more disturbing was their placement. The symbols followed the existing pattern perfectly, as if they had always been there. When questioned about the markings, the boy responded in his usual manner, fluent streams of the unknown language. His tone suggested he was providing explanations, even pointing to specific symbols as he spoke. But his words remained incomprehensible to everyone present. Mrs. Whitmore later reported that the boy had not moved from his chair during the night. She had checked on him twice, once at midnight, again at 3 in the morning. Each time, he sat in the same position, hands folded, eyes focused on the wall. Not sleeping, not moving, simply watching. Dr. Ashworth's examination of the room revealed no tools that might have been used to create the markings. No ink, no stylus, no instruments of any kind. The boy's hands showed no traces of paint or dye. His fingernails were clean and unbroken. Yet somehow, between sunset and sunrise, ancient Egyptian writing had materialized on English wallpaper. The physician's rational mind grasped for explanations. Perhaps the symbols had been there all along, invisible until certain lighting conditions revealed them. Perhaps the paper had been misprinted, the hieroglyphs added by accident at the London factory. But as Dr. Ashworth would soon discover, the wallpaper was about to present evidence that such theories could not accommodate. For the symbols were not merely decorative, they were moving. Professor Edmund Blackthorne of the Royal College of Antiquities arrived in Millbrook on the morning of March 18th. Dr. Ashworth had dispatched an urgent letter to London, requesting consultation on what he described as linguistic phenomena of unprecedented nature. Blackthorne traveled with a leather satchel containing reference materials, sketches of known hieroglyphic inscriptions, phonetic guides, comparative charts of ancient scripts. His reputation as Britain's leading expert on Egyptian writing systems preceded him, along with a certain scholarly skepticism. The professor expected to find nothing more than a disturbed child and a country doctor's overactive imagination. His first examination of the boy took place in the Whitmore House parlor at 2 o'clock that afternoon. Blackthorne spoke to the child in English, then attempted basic phrases in Latin and Greek. The boy responded consistently in his mysterious language, his pronunciation clear and unhesitating. When Blackthorne produced a collection of authentic hieroglyphic texts, papyrus fragments acquired during his travels in Egypt, the child's reaction was immediate. He leaned forward in his chair, extending one finger to trace specific symbols on the ancient documents. As he touched each character, he spoke its phonetic equivalent aloud. Professor Blackthorne later wrote to his colleague, Dr. Marcus Fenwick, "The child's pronunciations match theoretical reconstructions with startling accuracy." But accuracy was not the most unsettling aspect of the boy's performance. As Thomas traced each hieroglyph, the symbols seemed to darken under his fingertip. The aged papyrus, brittle and faded, momentarily regained the deep black ink of its creation. The effect lasted only seconds, but was witnessed by both Dr. Ashworth and Professor Blackthorne. Blackthorne's scientific training demanded controlled experiments to verify what he had observed. He presented the boy with a sheet of blank parchment and a modern steel pen. The child accepted both items, but made no attempt to write with conventional methods. Instead, he placed his palm flat against the parchment and began speaking in his usual ancient tongue. Gradually, hieroglyphic characters began to appear beneath his hand, not drawn, but emerging from within the paper itself. The symbols materialized in perfect formation, as if the parchment remembered an earlier existence. Professor Blackthorne examined the finished page under his portable microscope, a precision instrument crafted by the finest London opticians. The characters showed no evidence of ink penetration or surface marking. They appeared to exist within the fiber structure of the paper, impossible to achieve through any known printing or writing technique. When Blackthorne attempted to translate the text using his reference materials, he discovered that the boy had reproduced a passage from the Book of the Dead. Specifically, chapter 125, The Weighing of the Heart in the Afterlife. But this version contained variations unknown to any surviving manuscript. Additional verses that no Egyptologist had ever documented. Text that suggested the boy possessed access to sources that had been lost for millennia. 3 competing theories emerged as word of the Milborough case reached academic circles in London. The rationalist explanation, championed by Dr. Silas Moorcock of the Institute for Mental Sciences, proposed that the child suffered from a rare form of glossolalia. Religious ecstasy, Moorcock argued, could produce seemingly coherent speech in imaginary languages that coincidentally resembled ancient tongues. This theory gained support when investigators discovered that the boy exhibited other symptoms consistent with spiritual possession, periods of catalepsy, resistance to pain, and an uncanny ability to remain motionless for hours. But Moorcock's hypothesis failed to account for the materializing hieroglyphs or the boy's precise knowledge of undocumented Egyptian texts. The criminal theory, advanced by Inspector Harold Grimsby of Scotland Yard, suggested an elaborate hoax perpetrated by persons unknown. Perhaps the child had been trained by confidence men seeking to exploit Britain's fascination with Egyptian mysteries. The wallpaper could have been pre-treated with invisible inks that appeared under specific conditions. The parchment demonstrations might involve sleight of hand too subtle for academic observers to detect. Grimsby's investigation uncovered suspicious activity in the surrounding countryside, strangers asking questions about local accommodation, unusual purchases of chemical supplies from apothecaries in nearby towns. Yet no evidence linked these activities to the boy himself, and the inspector's theory could not explain the child's apparent materialization from empty heathland. The third explanation emerged from an unexpected source. Father Matthias Crane, a Jesuit priest with extensive knowledge of medieval accounts of supernatural phenomena. Crane proposed that Thomas Hartwell existed in a state of temporal displacement, simultaneously present in 1821 and some distant past. This theory, dismissed by secular investigators as superstitious nonsense, nonetheless addressed anomalies that rational explanations could not accommodate. The priest cited documented cases from monastery archives. Individuals who appear to live in multiple time periods simultaneously, speaking languages that predated their birth, possessing knowledge of events that had not yet occurred. Each theory commanded passionate defenders, yet each left crucial questions unanswered. Dr. Moorcock could not explain the accuracy of the boy's hieroglyphic transcriptions when compared to authentic Egyptian texts. Inspector Grimsby found no physical evidence of deception despite exhaustive forensic examination. Father Crane's theological explanations satisfied spiritual concerns but offered no mechanism by which temporal displacement might occur. The debate might have continued indefinitely, confined to academic journals and clerical correspondence. But on the night of March 21st, the boy demonstrated capabilities that transcended all existing theories. What happened in the Whitmore house parlor that evening would force investigators to confront possibilities that challenged the very foundations of natural law. And it would cost one observer his sanity, another his life. The final session began at 11:30 on the evening of March 21st, when the moon was dark and fog shrouded the village in impenetrable silence. Present in the Whitmore house parlor were Dr. Ashworth, Professor Blackthorne, Inspector Grimsby, and Father Crane, along with Mrs. Whitmore, serving as witness. The room had been prepared according to Inspector Grimsby's specifications. All furniture moved against the walls, oil lamps positioned to eliminate shadows, the floor marked with chalk lines to detect any movement. Thomas Hartwell sat in the room's center, hands folded in his lap, wearing the same simple clothes in which he had been discovered 6 days earlier. At precisely midnight, the boy began to speak in his ancient language, but his voice carried a resonance that had not been present in earlier sessions. The words seemed to emerge not from his throat alone, but from the walls themselves, the floorboards, the very air of the room. Professor Blackthorne later wrote that the sound was as if the building itself had acquired the power of speech. As the boy's recitation continued, the temperature in the parlor began to drop. Dr. Ashworth's thermometer, a precision instrument imported from German craftsmen, recorded a decrease of 15 degrees in as many minutes. The observer's breath became visible in the increasingly frigid air. But more disturbing than the cold was what began happening to the wallpaper. The hieroglyphic symbols that had appeared days earlier started to move, shifting position like living creatures crawling across the surface. Characters detached themselves from their original locations and rearranged into new configurations, forming sentences that had not existed moments before. Inspector Grimsby attempted to document the phenomenon with his police photographer's equipment, but the camera's flash powder refused to ignite in the unnatural atmosphere. At 17 minutes past midnight, the boy's voice stopped abruptly. The silence that followed was absolute. No sound of wind, no creaking of timber, no whisper of flame from the oil lamps. In that perfect quiet, those present heard something that violated every law of acoustics and reason. From somewhere beneath the floorboards came the sound of scratching, not the scrabbling of rats or the settling of wood, but the deliberate scraping of metal against stone. The sound of a stylus carving hieroglyphs into granite. Father Crane began reciting Latin prayers, but his words seemed to disappear into the unnatural silence without reaching the other's ears. Mrs. Whitmore pressed herself against the far wall, her face pale in the lamplight. At 3:17 in the morning, Thomas Hartwell opened his eyes and looked directly at Professor Blackthorne. When he spoke, his words were in perfect English. The scribe wishes to complete his work. Then the boy smiled, and his teeth were not those of a 12-year-old child. They were gold, inlaid with precious stones, carved with minute hieroglyphic inscriptions. The mouth of an Egyptian priest who had been dead for 3,000 years. By dawn on March 22nd, 3 of the 5 witnesses had fled Millbrook, abandoning their belongings and professional obligations. Mrs. Whitmore closed the inn permanently and moved to her sister's house in Cornwall, refusing ever to speak of what she had experienced. Inspector Grimsby returned to London, but submitted no official report. His superiors noted only that he had requested immediate reassignment to cases involving conventional crimes. Father Crane departed for a monastery in Ireland, where he spent the remaining years of his life in contemplative silence. Only Dr. Ashworth and Professor Blackthorne remained in the village, compelled by scientific duty to continue their observations of the boy. But Thomas Hartwell was no longer the passive subject he had been in earlier sessions. The morning after the midnight encounter, the child began demonstrating new capabilities that defied documentation. When Dr. Ashworth attempted to examine the boy's transformed teeth, his medical instruments became too hot to handle, despite the continued cold that permeated Whitmore House. Professor Blackthorne's efforts to sketch the hieroglyphic inscriptions were frustrated when his pencils wrote only in ancient Egyptian characters, regardless of his conscious intentions. The wallpaper throughout the building now displayed a continuous narrative in hieroglyphic script, telling the story of Katie, royal scribe, to Pharaoh Amenhotep III. The text described Katie's work on a sacred papyrus that would preserve his consciousness beyond death, allowing his knowledge to manifest in future ages. According to the wall inscriptions, the scribe's spirit had been searching for a suitable vessel for over 3 millennia. The boy Thomas Hartwell, if that had ever truly been his name, represented the culmination of that eternal quest. Dr. Ashworth's final journal entry, dated March 28th, records his growing certainty that the child was no longer entirely human. The boy eats nothing, drinks nothing, yet shows no signs of weakness or decline. His eyes reflect light like polished obsidian, and when he moves, I hear the whisper of linen wrappings, though he wears only common cloth. Yesterday, I observe him reading a text that exists nowhere in this room, following lines of hieroglyphs that appear in the air before his face, visible to him alone. Professor Blackthorne's last letter to his London colleagues, never sent, was found months later in his abandoned lodgings. The professor wrote of his growing conviction that ancient Egyptian methods of preserving consciousness had succeeded beyond their creators' wildest ambitions. We have encountered not possession in the biblical sense, but something far more sophisticated, the technological transfer of memory and identity across vast spans of time. The letter concluded with a confession that Blackthorne himself had begun experiencing episodes where he spoke in hieratic script without conscious volition. On April 2nd, 1821, both Dr. Ashworth and Professor Blackthorne disappeared from Millbrook. Their personal effects remained in their rooms, their research materials left scattered on tables, as if they had stepped out momentarily. The boy Thomas Hartwell was never seen again after that date. But the Whitmore House continued to manifest hieroglyphic inscriptions on its walls for 7 months after the disappearances, until the building was demolished by order of the Essex County authorities and the ground consecrated by 3 separate religious denominations. The official records of the Millbrook incident were sealed by parliamentary order in October 1821 and remained classified for 68 years. When the files were briefly reopened in 1889, they contained materials that had not been there originally, additional photographs, phonographic recordings, and chemical analyses performed with equipment that would not be invented until the 1870s. The documents suggested that the case had continued under government supervision long after the public investigation ended. References appeared to Project Hierophant, a clandestine study of temporal anomalies overseen by an unnamed department within the War Office. But within 24 hours of the files being accessed, they were resealed under the Official Secrets Act. The 1889 researcher who had requested the documents, Cambridge linguist Dr. Margaret Thornfield, suffered a complete mental breakdown and spent her remaining years in Bethlehem Hospital. She repeatedly claimed that ancient Egyptian scribes visited her cell each night, teaching her to write in languages that predated human civilization. Similar cases began appearing in government files throughout the late 19th century. Individuals who spontaneously developed the ability to speak dead languages, children who demonstrated knowledge of historical events that had been deliberately erased from all records. Each incident was investigated, documented, and classified, but no pattern emerged that rational analysis could explain. In 1923, During renovation of a manor house in Gloucestershire, workers discovered a hidden room containing dozens of hieroglyphic inscriptions carved into the stone walls. The text, when translated, told the story of Cady the scribe and his search for vessels to carry ancient wisdom into the modern world. The room had been sealed since the house's construction in 1847, 26 years after the Millbrook incident. Today, a digital scan of Dr. Ashworth's original daguerreotype resides in the archives of the British Museum, catalogued under unidentified photographic artifacts, 19th century. Museum technicians who examined the image using modern enhancement techniques discovered additional figures in the background. Shadowy forms wearing the ceremonial garb of Egyptian priests, apparently invisible to the original camera but detectable by contemporary analysis methods. Carbon dating of the photographic plate yielded impossible results. The materials tested as both 180 years old and over 3,000 years old simultaneously. The boy in the photograph continues to pose questions that archaeology and psychology cannot answer. Was Thomas Hartwell a real child transformed by forces beyond scientific understanding, or was he something else entirely from the beginning? If ancient Egyptian consciousness preservation techniques succeeded, how many other vessels might exist, walking undetected through our modern world? And why, in recent years, have museums worldwide reported that their hieroglyphic displays sometimes show different text in the morning than they displayed the night before? The Millbrook case file remains sealed, but the questions it raised have never been resolved. If cases like this fascinate you, subscribe and turn on notifications for the next file. Disclaimer: this script is a work of fiction. Names, characters, places, institutions, and incidents are invented or used fictitiously. Any resemblance to real persons, living or dead, or actual events is purely coincidental, created solely for entertainment.